So my colleagues have shown me how to share my screen, so I think I'll be capacitated to be able to do that on my own. So thanks for that, Kalisa.
It starts at 4.
No, so at 3.
It starts at 3.
Yeah.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Greetings to one and all. Over the past 2 decades, restorative justice has evolved and applied in many contexts, and every year, International Restorative Justice Week, there is a flurry of excitement and activity within the global restorative justice community. It is time when practitioners, advocates, policymakers, and academics come together to create awareness, share knowledge and experience, and debate not only the diverse applications of restorative justice approaches, but also, as we would see today, the transformative potential of restorative justice. This year, the theme is Protect and Empower the Person Harmed. Given the many contestations and debates around social cohesion, social justice, criminal and transitional justice, and even climate justice for that matter, this webinar is therefore significant, important, and timeless. The format of the webinar will be as follows. Professor Kalema will officially welcome you on behalf of University of KwaZulu-Natal. Thereafter, we would have had our guest speaker, Dr. Carl Stoffel, who is running late, and we are hoping he will join us later. He will be followed by Mr. Mike Batley, Ms. Vanessa Padiachi, and Ms. Leslie Ann van Selm. Professor Anne Skelton will highlight the key issues and chart a way forward, and I'm hoping that this should leave us 30 minutes for question and answer. Kindly post your comments and questions on the Q&A, and during this session, panelists will attempt to address as many questions as possible, time permitting. May I now call upon Professor Kalema, who is the Dean and Head of the School of the Built Environment and Development Studies, to welcome you on behalf of the Faculty of Humanities at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Professor Kalema.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Hagoven, and welcome to you far and near to this very, very special webinar on this very, very special week, the International Restorative Justice Week, and in particular because of our current uncertain context. We live in volatile and unsafe world, and the vulnerable and the underserved suffer daily, expose them to. The theme of this year's International Restorative Justice Week, Protect and Empower the Person Harmed, calls us to action. I'm very optimistic that in order for us to restore what is broken and address injustices, it takes all of us present today, a community, a village, and in our case, communities of practice, to understand the impact of harm in our lives and to restore justice and dignities to victims, survivors, and those who have atoned and ask for forgiveness through words and deeds. We are looking forward to learn from my esteemed colleagues this afternoon, this morning, how we can intentionally intervene. Thank you to our partners, Kulisa Social Solutions, and the Restorative Justice Center for bringing all of us together. So on behalf of our Vice Chancellor, Professor Nana Poku, our DVC, Professor Ntlanhla Mkhize, the College of Humanities, and the entire leadership of this great university, College of Humanities and the School of Built Environment and Development Studies, I welcome you. Such an occasion is very rare, yet an important one in a university calendar because it brings all of us together and gives us an opportunity as a community to collectively tackle very important issues that affect us all. We have an esteemed group of colleagues who, through their wisdom and lived experiences as practitioners, advocates, community builders, local and global trends in restorative justice and community mediation. We hope to learn more and deeply around national policies and implementation plans, stories of healing and restoration, grassroots approaches to mediation, and a way forward towards healing and restoration. So I'm excited. I don't know about you. It shows in my smile today that we're very, very looking forward to this time together. And thank you, Dr. Hagoban, for leading us and bringing us together. Welcome to all.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kalema. Ladies and gentlemen, and all of you around the world who have joined us today, let me now introduce our next speaker, who is Mr. Mike Batley. Mr. Mike Batley is a co-founder and director of the Restorative Justice Center, a well-established civil society organization, and he has made an enormous contribution towards mainstreaming restorative approaches to justice in the criminal justice system and engaging with relevant state departments in the provision of restorative justice services in South Africa. The adoption and application of restorative approaches to justice in a range of policies and pieces of legislation in South Africa is due mainly to normative potential. However, strategies for implementation will need stakeholder engagement, and this has largely stalled. In his address, Mr. Batley will revisit the National Policy Framework and Implementation Plan 2016. Mr. Mike Batley.
Thank you very much, Hera, and thank you so much to you and the university and to Professor Kalema for contributing and making this afternoon possible. And good afternoon to everybody who's joining us. It's really very exciting to be part of an event like this with so many partners joining. So as Dr. Hargovan said, I'm going to focus on the National Policy Framework. And then I'm also going to speak a little bit about some research that Professor Skelton and I did. It doesn't really, it's not directly tied to the National Policy Framework, but it gives us an idea of the current status of restorative justice in South Africa. So the process of developing the National Policy Framework was initiated under the Department of Justice's Chief Directorate for Vulnerable Groups back in 2009. So it was driven by them, and it included the other JCPS cluster departments, as well as a number of civil society organizations. It was approved in 2011, and then there was a change of leadership in the Chief Directorate. And the new leader there, the new Chief Director, pointed out that we had not reflected the perspectives of traditional leaders at all. And so 2013, 2014, there was quite a bit of intense consultation, workshops with traditional leaders, if I remember correctly, in 5 of the provinces. So quite a bit of consultation, and which led to some redrafting, continuing to work on to polish it. And then by 2015, 2016, the document was ready to be signed off by everybody who participated in it. And I think everybody there was very happy with it. But at that point, it was then moved to the policy unit because it was felt that it didn't really belong then with vulnerable groups, but should be part of the broader policy of the department. But since then, there's been absolute silence. So it seems that something went wrong in that transfer process. And in the process, or in preparation for today, I was not able, despite taking some effort, to find anybody who could give me an indication of what the status of the report is. It was on the Department of Justice's website for some time, but I can't find it there either. So it is now on the Restorative Justice Centre's website if people would like to look for it there. So I'm biased because I played a very active role in drafting the document. But having said that, I do think it is still quite a useful document. So it's over 5 years old now. So if we were to revisit it, it probably would take some revision. But I think it could be finalized quite quickly if we were to revisit it at this point. So I think it is still a very useful and helpful document that we can come back to. So I thought I'd reflect some important features. These are the stated objectives in the document: to promote uniform implementation of restorative justice, to enhance a coordinated approach, and to guide and facilitate the increased use of restorative justice in the country. It draws on definitions in the United Nations documents, particularly the UN Handbook on Restorative Justice. The work that we did in engaging with traditional leaders is reflected by way of a number of indigenous idioms that reflect a restorative way of thinking about justice. And I was particularly excited about that when we drafted that into the document, because that makes it a very uniquely South African document and also shows how restorative justice really is an ancient concept, certainly not a Western one, and how it continues to be held in our local idioms that are obviously very old. The document articulates restorative justice by way of referencing it to different branches of law, so criminal, family, and civil law. And it also locates restorative justice mediation within the field of appropriate dispute resolution, something that I think is also very important, because something that has happened over the last number of years is a convergence between the fields of mediation generally and restorative justice. It also distinguishes the approach of restorative justice from mediation and other programs, like life skills and vocational skills programs. It shows the connections to victim empowerment, to offender reintegration, and to crime prevention. Very significantly, it spells out in quite a bit of detail the roles and responsibilities of various stakeholders, including the JCPS cluster. And then it specifically mentions civil society organizations, and this is what it says in the document, that CSOs are regarded as key partners for the delivery of restorative justice services. It is inherent in the concept of restorative justice that communities and community organizations are enabled to fulfill significant roles in service delivery. So I think that's some very important perspectives and statements and positions about the roles and responsibilities there. Moving then to the research that Professor Skelton and I undertook and published under this title in 2019. So this was following on some research that we'd done about 10 years earlier, which was published in 2006. And so we called the report this time "Whither Restorative Justice in South Africa," with a bit of a play on the word "whither" there, meaning what direction is restorative justice taking, but also questioning, is it withering and dying? The main focus in this document is on restorative justice mediation. And so we also there do make the distinction between, with other work like life skills and vocational training, whether that's at a divergence level or at a non-custodial sentence level. So this research was done using desktop work between 2016 and 2019. And we concluded that there was a lot of activity and promise in the years between 1996 and 2008. But since then, things have definitely stalled, because the levels of implementation have actually reduced. Some of the reasons for that are that child justice referrals have never grown to the levels that were anticipated. And many of you will know that restorative justice mediation is specifically stated in the Child Justice Act. And so that was part of why there was an anticipated growth because of the statutory provision for that. Adult diversion work has developed, but it's still in its infancy, I think. We certainly don't have any statutory basis for it. There has been some work done to develop a policy, but that seems not to have been approved either. And so there isn't really a framework to regulate adult diversion. Mediation is being funded to some extent in other diversion work by the various departments of social development. But this is very ad hoc, so it's not implemented systematically, and significantly, it's also not measured. So it's quite difficult to say how much is happening or exactly what kind of restorative justice mediation is happening. Something that is very significant is that it has continued to be driven by the Department of Correctional Services at the post-sentence stage. My understanding is that the department has quite limited capacity to do this. There's, I think, one social auxiliary worker allocated per service area to trace victims and then to set up the meetings. So a number of CSOs have stepped in to support the department, but without any financial support. And for any CSOs who work in this area, you'll know that with offenders or ex-offenders is extremely difficult to find funding for that. So that remains very, very challenging and also then quite limited because of that. Something we did find that was interesting was that there is an increasing amount of activity in schools. So using the concepts of restorative justice, sometimes it's called restorative discipline, sometimes just restorative practices. And a lot has been done to develop that internationally. In South Africa, that now seems to be happening quite a bit, a lot of interest in private schools. As best we can tell, not much in the public school sector. But compared to the work that we did in 2006, some significant growth and development in that specific space. We also reflected on some of the reasons for this. Some of it, I think, is that the state has wanted to assume more and more responsibility for the work that it is entrusted with. And so you'll be familiar with the debates about a developmental state and a capable state that we've been having since about 2007, 2008. I think it's quite striking that while this debate has been framed with the state saying it needs to take on and carry the full responsibility for as much as possible, in many areas that's been happening at the same time, simultaneously, as reduced capacity within the state. And so we're hearing less now about the developmental state and much more about a capable state and the severe consequences of an incapable state. And some of the reflections about the July looting has referred to that. And so I think what has happened, some of you may remember some scenario planning done some years ago where they spoke about walk together and walk apart. And I think this reflects very much a walk apart scenario where the state believes it can do a number of things, tries to do them. Civil society sees the gaps, tries to engage with government to partner, but finds that very difficult. And so we have these two almost separate streams. Especially within this decreasing ability of the state to collaborate, to coordinate, and also to be trusted. And that's not just my opinion, that's been documented in a number of places. And certainly even within the Welfare White Paper Review, that sentiment that the Department of Social Development, all of them, nationally and provincially, the level of trust has been very badly eroded. And so it's very tempting to disengage in a scenario like that. we've tried to pick up a couple of practice issues to give some direction. There's been quite a bit of research done by people in the field of criminology and peace studies that we need to link restorative justice practice to peace building and to violence reduction and prevention, and also find ways to connect interpersonal levels of violence with structural and community violence. And I think this is, I'm sure other countries are grappling with this as well, but I think that this is the main challenge for us in the restorative justice field in South Africa, is that it's very easy. In fact, it's probably the default position to focus just on mediation at an interpersonal level, dealing with interpersonal conflict. But we need to understand that interpersonal conflict as a function, as a symptom, as located within other forms and levels of violence. And so the challenge is then, how do we connect our intervention to those more macro levels of response that is required as well? We endorsed some advocacy issues that were made by Dr. Stoffel and some work that he was doing at the time that we wrote this. And he spoke about the need to balance restorative justice as an interpersonal social service practice, which is what it is when it's funded, by DSD, and a framing paradigm for systemic change by understanding restorative justice as a social movement. And so we need to connect restorative justice with various other social movements, for example, like the Me Too, the hate crimes movement, the gender-based violence movement, and many others, and show the value that restorative justice can add there. And so we need to form individual and organizational alliances that can support strategic, organizational, and logistical requirements for durable change, while at the same time developing and sustaining strong localized practice. And on that score, let me just make a brief aside that some work has been done with a group under the umbrella called the South African Restorative Justice Accreditation Body, SARJAB, benchmarking off the fields of family mediation and commercial mediation to set parameters for accrediting training and accrediting practitioners. And we are quite well advanced with that, and we are at the point where we would be able to now actually accredit training programs and practitioners. And Dr. Stoffel then also spoke about the need to ensure collaboration between individuals and organizations, both within the field and outside the field, to drive transformation of the system as a whole. So that's very challenging, but I think that reflects a systemic, broad view, and nothing less is what is required to meet the challenges of justice at this time. So where does that leave us right now? Personally, I hope that we can use today to form a new broad alliance to advocate for increased implementation of restorative justice. And what I mean by that is a smallish group of people who would be committed to this idea and who could meet and find ways then to together lobby the government JCPS cluster to finalize the national policy framework. Also to come back to the strategy and implementation plan that was started but never taken any further, and to ensure systematic implementation that is supported at the highest levels. And then obviously none of this is going to help us go forward unless there's a real commitment to financial resourcing of the plan. Even if that's over a long period, we need to start somewhere, and we need to show the country's commitment to actually implementing restorative justice. Thank you very much, Chairperson. Sorry, Hema, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, my apologies. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Batley, for that informative and insightful presentation. Yes, indeed. we will definitely need to do much more to revitalize the restorative justice project in South Africa. And we will also need to look at the implementation of practice standards, which have been developed but have not been implemented. So thank you very much for that very, very interesting presentation. My next speaker is Ms. Vanessa Padiachi. Ms. Padiachi has worked with both victims and perpetrators in a range of settings, and she has played an active role in shaping crime prevention and correctional policy and law in South Africa. In this session, Stories of Healing and Restoration, Vanessa Padiachi will present a brief summary of 3 case studies from interviews conducted with individuals who had experienced a restorative justice intervention. Thank you, Vanessa. You may proceed.
Thank you, Hema. So we're going to play you 3 short videos with the 3 case studies that come from Kolisa. And as Dr. Hargovan mentioned, in between each video, I'm going to just tell you a little snippet of what had happened in terms of the restorative process, what was the outcome, and what type of intervention was used. So I think we're going to start with Peter Capasso. We're going to play, Peter's going to introduce himself.
Hi everyone, my name is Peter Capasso, founder and managing director of Intouch Youth Development and Community Justice. From the past, I've been practicing community development until I joined Kolisa Social Solutions in 2012. I was then appointed as a restorative justice practitioner as well as a project coordinator. Through Kolisa Social Solutions, that's where Intouch Youth Development was born. What is it that we do at Intouch? We empower, we inspire, we enable. Those are the things that we face when we are capacitating our community, of which we are working on 4 categories. That is information, advice and referral, social awareness, youth and skills development, and health and lifestyle. When the community development is effective, there is less crime, less disparity between citizens, better jobs available, a more talented workforce, and less overall issues that impact residents. As Intouch, we have changed a handful of youth and the community at large through conflict resolution, peacemaking cycles, and especially for gender-based violence that is acting as a pandemic in the society. At Intouch Youth Development and Community Justice, we believe that I am here because you exist. Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. My name is Ronnie. I thank you.
We thank Peter for his introduction. So Peter's actually a 38-year-old Zimbabwean man who moved to South Africa in 2007. I think he was introduced to Kolisa when he worked in Limpopo with Mokopane Needs Forum, where he did a puppet awareness program. So Peter's quite experienced through Kolisa, being a restorative justice practitioner, and he's been involved in the implementation of a range of restorative justice interventions, from a school bullying program where they use different types of mediation with learners and parents and teachers, to community conflict resolution. And also, like he mentioned, the puppet awareness show, working at courts and VEP centers. So he's quite experienced since 2012 in restorative justice. But an incident happened where Peter, as a restorative justice practitioner, amongst restorative practitioners themselves, there was a conflict. And the conflict was about the fact that Peter was a foreign national, and they didn't feel that he could lead this group. And it was then, as restorative practitioners, they had a group meeting, a group mediation, and a circle process. And they got to understand that there was some sort of discrimination. Some of the members had to leave the group, but then the others continued. And I think the outcome was that the process, restorative justice process, allowed them to get to understand what was the cause of the conflict. An agreement was reached. And then Peter continued, and he actually won the heart of the community after, because he was so passionate about community development and restorative justice, and that then built the community's confidence in him as a person. So his call to action Peter says restorative justice can make an impact in society. His call is, I would love to see a free and peaceful community free from conflict and violence. If you have offended someone, confront the victim with the help of mediators. Settle the matter so you can move forward in your life. No man is an island. I may have offended you, but there's an opportunity for reconciliation. And his closing statement is quite powerful, where he talked about the philosophy of Ubuntu. I'm healed because you exist. So thank you to Peter. We will next be playing the video for Xolisa Olifant.
Good afternoon. My name is Xolisa Olifant and I'm a Khulisa beneficiary. We people with albinism, we suffer many ridicules. Most of these ridicules, they come from within the family circle. As you may know, most of us suffer from low self-esteem. Most of us, we don't know where our rights are or what are my rights as a person with albinism. It's where Khulisa comes in with their programs so that we can know in case something happens to me, where can I turn to? What are my rights as a citizen? Because at the end of the day, we are all citizens. There are so many diverse and wonderful programs that Khulisa is running. We have this family circle dialogue. It helps the families when there is a rift or maybe if there's a problem within the family. It has a support group as well as a functioning support group for the family. Khulisa has taught me through their programs how to stand on my own 2 feet. If I have a problem, how to encounter. If maybe there's a dialogue somewhere, I must be part of that dialogue because I aim to be one of those people that are living with albinism to make my voice heard. Because I'm here to make a mark so that the ones that are following, they know, they are aware, they will not go through what we went through. So Khulisa is part and parcel of the journey of the actual recording is uploaded. And with that, Khulisa, very much
Thank you. I do apologize. I can see that maybe Xoliswa's video was a bit soft, but I'm just going to give you a kind of background into. So Xoliswa Olifant is a 45-year-old woman from Randfontein and a mother of 2 girls and 2 boys. So she basically had an interesting experience. She was an intern at the City Lodge between 2018 and 2019. And because of her condition of having a pigmentation problem and being diagnosed with albinism, she could not see properly whilst doing her job. So she completed the internship in September 2019, and 3 weeks after the internship was completed, she was invited to attend a Khulisa program. Xoliswa says that people with albinism suffer much ridicule from society and they have low self-esteem. At the Khulisa program, she learned that people with albinism do not know their rights. She learned that she could stand up for her rights. If there was a problem in the future, she felt confident that she would handle it in a constructive way, and her confidence increased. She felt she could make a mark. She then realized that she had recommendations to City Lodge about how they could improve the working tools for people with disabilities and in the instance of hiring a person with albinism. She talked about considering an ID enhancer and a screen enhancer. She was also introduced to restorative justice and family circle dialogues, where Khulisa offered this to families who have children or family members have albinism and conflict arises in the family. There was also a support group for families. So the intervention was with the help of Khulisa Social Solutions. Khulisa went back to the City Lodge group and told them about her, what she would like to do. And a meeting was arranged with the City Lodge group in 2019, November, with the help of Khulisa. And the outcome was that the City Lodge group graciously accepted her recommendations, even to have an awareness and sensitization program for people with disabilities for the staff. And they asked her to email her recommendations. And in March 2021, the City Lodge itself called her and asked her advice about them wanting to hire someone with albinism in their housekeeping department, and what would she recommend. So Khulisa continues to serve her community and assist people with albinism, and she's really thankful to Khulisa that they've been such a support for her, and how powerful this restorative justice process was. Her call to action is when we get to our workplaces, we must know our rights. We should ask before complaining. Make your voices heard. Do not let things just be. There are proper channels. It doesn't mean you have to toy and be confrontational. You can try and sit down with the boss and have a respectful conversation, help them to understand the issue. And so she agrees that even in the workplace, there's conflict. It would be wonderful to have mediators that will help alleviate stress. And finally, she would like to encourage people with albinism who depend on learnerships to take a leap of faith in applying for jobs in the formal market. Shift your focus from not I'm unable to taking the leap of faith. So I think this was a powerful approach in restorative justice for Xolisa. So we play the last video of Lydia Sono.
Hi, my name is Lydia Sono. 2007, I joined Xolisa's crime prevention. I was just a first lesbian to come out and to work with a group of people. And it was so difficult for me working with straight, especially straight children. As for the community, it was not easy. I was facing everyday challenge. I was in love with my girlfriend. We were then attacked in our house with my girlfriend. We were both raped. It was worse when we go to report there by the police station. I then formed with a LGBTI support group at the Xolisa. That's where I was creating community dialogues with all the stakeholders to get involved. We are accepted because of the dialogue that I am creating. Today, I am having my own Lydia Sono Foundation, and I am looking forward to many people to come out to work with us. Guys, let us all join hands, working together to fight this everyday discrimination with us. Let us change the world, support us, let us unite.
So as you can see, that's Lydia Sono. She's 35 years old and from Nkomazi, Shumansdal in Mpumalanga. She's a community builder, she worked with Xolisa previously and in crime prevention. She was actually one of the only community development people, that could identify as from the LGBTIQ community. And so what happened was in 2014, Lydia and her girlfriend were attacked and raped. And she tried to, they weren't going to report the case initially to the police, but when they did, they were ridiculed, they were discriminated against. Even the hospital told her to wear a dress, the church. So every place where, they could access services, unfortunately, she experienced discrimination. And that's when Lydia decided to set up a support group for other people from the LGBTIQ group that were experiencing discrimination as well. And then the restorative justice intervention that was used was community dialogues. So she called together different departments, Department of Health, the SAPs, and invited them to a dialogue where she was able to tell her story. And it's incredible that, after she told her story, she began to receive support from these different stakeholders, including even the MEC. So, and eventually Lydia set up her own foundation, as you heard, the Lydia Sono Foundation, where she continues with the activism in the community and being a voice for the voiceless, and having these support groups, and more people, LGBTIQ groups that are coming out, are beginning to share their stories. And her call for action is, as South Africans, we should join hands like Xolisa did in helping them. To give support to LGBTIQ groups. They want help, but they don't know where to go. We need to have 100% support from organizations. There's so much of discrimination and judgment towards the LGBTIQ group community. Let's work together to end discrimination. And she lastly said, I am not the rape that happened to me. I am Lydia. So there you see restorative justice, really restoring human dignity. I think just to summarize on some observations and reflections, we see from the 3 case studies how restorative justice practices can really be used to heal, bring healing to individuals and communities, building meaningful relationships, addressing harms, and working towards reconciliation. You could see the creative ways in which restorative justice can be used in different settings and to address a broad range of conflicts, including discrimination, like xenophobia in Peter's case, and with Koliswa and Lydia. We also hear that there are many types of restorative. The settings could be police stations, VEP centers, communities, and the workplace, as we saw in Koliswa. We also see how restorative justice is actually a key component of community development and also towards ensuring community justice. This is in line very much with the work, I think Mike talked about it earlier, but also the work of Gordon Bazmore and Mara Schiff that talk about an approach called restorative community justice that really represents a convergence of ideas and practices from both restorative justice and community justice movements, and focusing obviously on harms and strengths of individuals in resolving problems. So we see a wonderful way of that coming together in that case study. We see that conflict can happen amongst restorative justice practitioners, and that we as restorative justice practitioners need to live the values and be able to use it in our own lives. We also heard about the wonderful African philosophy of Ubuntu. Really about Ubuntu is really about a common bond that exists between all people, and that actually we affirm humanity when we acknowledge others and the power of being connected and being reconciled in relationships. We also saw workplace mediation featuring and wonderful ways of how to talk non-violently and compassionate conversations in the workplace, having mediators in the workplace. And then we also saw the benefits of restorative justice in enhancing community involvement. I think one of the key things that Kolisi was also trying to emphasize is how communities themselves can take ownership of restorative justice processes, where the state not necessarily has to be a gatekeeper around this. And really, if communities are empowered, you see all of them independently running restorative justice interventions in their own NGOs and their own work that they're doing. And I love the empowering of building capacity and then allowing communities to take ownership of this. So yeah, we see that every individual matters. I think Lydia's story tells us that every individual, all 3 actually, every individual matters, every individual has a role to play. And we can see that human dignity needs to be restored, and that restorative justice ultimately is about building community, building justice, building peace. And that, as Mike said, it's a beautiful way in which we create the social movement of restoring and healing our communities. So thank you for your time. And we're going to just honor those 3, Peter, Lydia, and Koliswa, for their stories today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you. It is only through acknowledging these stories and to actually hear the people's voices, their lived experiences of victimization and ultimate empowerment, and ultimately the healing process that takes place after a restorative process has been experienced. So thank you very much, Vanessa, and thank you especially to the participants in those videos. We have good news. Dr. Stoffel has joined us. Welcome, Carl. And I think I'm going to call our keynote address and our guest speaker to address you now. It is an honor and privilege for me to call you to address us, Dr. Stoffel. You're a strategic leader with 30+ years experience in peace, justice, and reconciliation initiatives, and an alumni of UKZN. So Dr. Stoffel will address you on restorative justice, a social service or a social movement. Over to you, Carl. Thank you.
Thank you, Hema. And I apparently missed the time, so I apologize. I'm not sure what part got confused along the way. My sincere apologies. I'm sorry I
long as
missed
you can.
whatever amount of time we've already had here. Let me make the most of this time then. And I just came back from a trip from Cameroon, so I'm probably a little disoriented. I'm not sure, we'll figure that out later. But so wonderful to be here with you and to be in this environment.
Dr. Carl, may I just take the Dean's input? I think he has his hand up. Maybe he
Sure.
wants to welcome you personally, Professor. Prof. Kalema.
No, I think I made a mistake by that, but I will take the opportunity nonetheless to welcome our keynote speaker. Thank you so much for joining us. And I know it has been probably hard for you with the travel and the COVID era. So thank you for joining us, and we welcome you. Thank you.
Carl, you may proceed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. For those who might not know, I spent 16 years living in South Africa, and it became very much a part of our life and our home and our family. My children did K through 12 in South Africa. I did my PhD work at University of KwaZulu-Natal, a proud alumni of that. And so it's just a real pleasure to engage here again. And again, I apologize for any inconvenience on the timing of this. I am going to go ahead and go right into my discussion for the sake of time. I hope that I'm able to share the screen. I think if that can be, let me try and make sure we are, is this visible to folks?
Yes, it is. And Dr. Carl, you have your full time, so please go ahead and indulge us.
Thank you very much. I entitled this talk, Restorative Justice, a Social Service or a Social Movement. For those of you who know myself and my work, this has been somewhat of a focus, a very important focus for me as an academic, as well as a practitioner in the field. And I strongly believe in this concept, though I know that it's not endorsed by all. And so let me see if I can make the case for what I believe is a global social justice movement, and restorative justice is providing a framing, principles, practices, and a new way of perceiving how justice can be satisfied in our world. I'm going to assume a lot of us have the basics of restorative justice. So I'm going to jump right in the Q&A. If there's other questions around that, we can take that forward. But restorative justice, since its inception in its contemporary history and in the early 1970s in Canada, has always been a contested terrain. We have to look at origin stories when we look at how a particular concept is being contested. And of course, we know that the power of restorative justice in its early years grew out of the criminal legal system and providing an alternative to the criminal legal system through a process of holding those who committed harm accountable to meet and face those they've harmed and come up with processes of repair and other ways of healing. But we also know that in some ways as a practice growing field, and we became entrapped in the criminal legal system as the primary place where restorative justice was expressed. And in that process, we were following in the first few decades, a very similar trajectory of other professional accredited processes. We were looking at standardization and procedures and the sort of idea of this becoming a qualified social service that one could study and get qualified or certified to do sort of a professional technical skill set. And while I think all of that has its value, I'm concerned that as we focus that down to the point of a set of skill sets, we may lose the bigger picture. And so I'm arguing that this is more than a really good social service. And all of us who have practiced know that restorative justice has magical moments, but we need to think about this as bigger than that. Dr. Howard Zehr, who I studied with and also taught with, introduced then in 1990 with his seminal work on changing lenses, the idea that restorative justice is more than a social service. He made an argument, maybe not explicitly, but introduced the language of paradigm shift, which is the idea that our paradigm of what justice is and how it's accomplished could shift and should shift. And he was really ahead of his time, as many original voices and authors in fields are. And so he led the way for us to begin to think about this idea of a paradigm shift. Many people pushed back because at the time they imagined a paradigm shift being sort of taking one system and throwing it out and replacing it with a whole new system. And that was too overwhelming to imagine. Sort of the Thomas Kuhnian idea of a paradigm shift, a mechanical paradigm shift. We know now that these paradigm shifts happen in human ecology in a way that's much more like a natural system that changes and morphs and grows, and we introduce different elements into the system and it may change. And so what we're experiencing now, in my opinion, is a social movement, and I would hope a social justice movement. Let me make a few points as to why I believe restorative justice is more than a social movement. I mean, more than a social service and much more like a social movement. I studied and taught nonviolence and looking at social movements. And that's when the moment came where I said, maybe if we started to study restorative justice as a social movement, we would see a different picture than just a good social service, one amongst many on a menu that social workers or probation officers could use. What I believe overall is that restorative justice offers us a paradigm that's nonviolent, meaning we have a justice system currently that is still predicated on violence. It's a justice system that says, I need to hurt you to show you that hurting other people is wrong. And that the state justifies, I hurt you to tell you that hurting other people is wrong. Or even in capital punishment, we kill you because we want to send the message that killing people is wrong. It doesn't take long to see how that logic reinvents itself, regenerates, and we have an iterative process of violence, whether it's state sanctioned or not. I believe restorative justice, with all of its flaws, is one of the few frameworks of justice that is being offered, along with transformative justice, a more recent movement, is offering an alternative to our current criminal legal system, which is configured around the idea of punishment. We are obsessed with the idea of punishment, that if we punish, people will change behavior and attitude. And while that might work from time to time, it's primarily based on fear and it's violence-based. And usually what happens then is the offender becomes the victim, the harmed becomes the harm doer, or the harm doer becomes the harmed. And we see this cyclical process going forward. And so I believe restorative justice provides us an intergenerational justice, a justice that I would want to pass on to my children, because it's a nonviolence justice. It's a justice of nonviolence that assumes that people change in many different ways. And accountability replaces punishment in the way in which we understand punishment as pain for the sake of pain. There are many ways in which we're seeing restorative justice blossom. I can say in the last, I would say, half dozen years, we have seen the theory and the research of restorative justice just take off exponentially. It's almost hard to keep up. It is hard, sort of breathless to think of how this is growing. And so what I'm seeing as I scan the movement is that the interdisciplinary nature of the movement has been really, really important to this work. So remembering without revenge is one of the things I often talk about, speaking of trauma and the mind and our ability to handle serious conflict or violence in our lives and heal from it and become resilient. What we know is that the new neuroscience is teaching us so many things, but it is helping us to understand those magical moments of restorative justice that we talk about. What we're finding out, the neuroscientists are telling us, among many things that are related to restorative justice, is that our brains, our human brain, is actually pre-wired, wired biologically to seek out relationship, to seek out community. Contrary to what individualistic westernized theory has taught us, that we are individuals, that units that stand alone, we are actually communal. and collectivized. And we want to find meaningful relationships, which is why restorative justice has become so powerful, even at very serious types of harm, and even as applied in transitional justice or national war to peace processes. So what we're seeing also is many other things. The empathy of our brain, the ability of humans to exercise empathy is strong, provided it's given the structure to do that. And when empathy is offered, empathy is often returned. And that's what we see happening in many of our restorative justice processes, is empathy is being heightened on both sides until we can come to a place where humanization becomes the order of the day. We also, just one more example in the neuroscience, of course, is mimicry, the idea of how our brains can mimic another. For instance, when you're eating and I'm watching you, even if I don't have food, my brain is telling me what that tasted like and what I could have, which is why then I go buy something that you have because it looks good. And that means our brains are constantly mimicking. Now, this can be destructive or constructive. And yet we know that when we set up a constructive process of restorative justice, then in fact that mimicry is used for the betterment of all and for the saving of lives and for the healing of both the harmed and the harmed doers. We also know that restorative justice and nonviolence are feeding each other in research and understanding. I believe that, as I've already said, that it's a nonviolent intergenerational justice, but I also understand that nonviolence is critical to change. All over the world, we are now seeing the power of people in social movements to protest against military regimes, to protest all sorts of things, whether it's climate change and so many other sectors. And we're seeing the power of that growing globally. And I believe restorative justice offers a framework in which to say we want individual and structural change. We demand that as people, and we want that non-violently. We also see restorative justice as becoming a tool and a mechanism, or not even that, an approach to community building and community development, social cohesion, if you wish. We need to understand, I believe, that restorative justice is a form of building social capital. What we're discovering is more and more community organizers and community development folk are coming to restorative justice and saying, here's something that we can use in our own organization. Because what we've often known, and this is also in the nonviolent action arena, that sometimes in our quest for peace, we treat each other very badly. And there's been a lot of casualties within our nonviolent movements, or our movements for peace, or our movements for change. And restorative justice is offering an internal process, not only an internal process, but a really important internal process on how we should relate to each other as the activist community, but also how do we bring community together? So we're finding that circles and many other processes that are familiar to restorative justice practitioners are becoming places where the community processes very important security and safety issues, very important community issues that need to be wrestled with in an equal and fair and participatory manner. And restorative justice is providing those containers. There are many other parts I could talk about, its application in schools and in universities, in, like I said, climate change, in the health sector. We're seeing a connection to public health in the sense that we're beginning to understand violence as public health. And if we're understanding violence as public health, we need to look at how violence spreads. And restorative justice is helping us manage or think about what are the processes that could contain that conversation. In New Zealand, they used restorative justice very successfully for a whole set of class action suits against the public health system because of surgical mesh and what it was causing in persons who had been who had operated on and had surgical mesh in their system. There was a lot of backlash or unexpected side effects that needed to be dealt with. We had, in this situation, the New Zealand Ministry of Health sitting down with those who had been affected, their families, and also the insurance and medical field, generally having a conversation facilitated by restorative justice processes to begin to figure out what would be fair and meaningful reparations and repair and restitution in that situation. I could name many other incidences. Maybe we can get into that in other conversation. Lastly, I want to say, and this is my own experience, restorative justice has become a very important mechanism, not only mechanism, but framework and worldview to look at transitional justice. And of course, to understand to some degree, indigenous processes and to apply them in hybrid form. And so I was involved not only in the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where we brought together the communities and surviving families with persons who had applied for amnesty, who were willing. And those were in the early years. And since then, I moved on and worked in many different places. But one place that I've contributed, or I've focused my research for many years, has been Sierra Leone in West Africa, which had both a special court and a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but realized that both of those were sort of foreign frameworks that did not actually assist the people to reconcile and heal. And so they resurrected a indigenous process called Fembo Talk, which is family talk. It's a movement from the ground up. It's been going since 2008, touching thousands of lives and helping people to heal through an indigenous process where the values and the cosmology, the worldview make sense in context, which is so critical to our work. So when I talk about social movement theory, there are three critical conditions. There are many, but this is to be very simple and straightforward in this presentation. We need a political opportunity. We need to see resource mobilization, and we need to have a framing message. Now, I would argue that globally, all three of these things are in place for restorative justice as a social movement. We have tremendous political opportunity as we see this backlash of authoritarian and dictatorial leadership, as we see a sort of hierarchy coming back, a political order of military regimes, as we are constantly being bombarded with this, this reminder that the peace processes are failing, except for maybe, I always hear Colombia. But what we know is that is an opportunity. That's a danger, but it's also an opportunity. And as if we begin to understand restorative justice as a movement, we can step into those gaps and begin to take that political opportunity. Second of all, resource mobilization. I know that this has been a challenge in South Africa, and it remains a challenge in many parts of the world. I think it's a challenge partly because of the specificity of the way we have seen restorative justice as a social service. What we need to begin to understand is seeing all these applications far beyond the criminal legal system allow us new opportunities to think about how restorative justice could be applied and funded. There have been a few breakthroughs in working with donors, and I will mention Fembo Talk as one, where we found a private foundation, not we, but they found a private foundation in the United States called Peace Catalyst, who was so interested in the long-term healing and resilience of Sierra Leone that they committed a 15-year funding program. Now that's very unusual, but if we could at least begin to get our donor funding community to understand that this is a long-term shift, a cultural shift, and to begin to think about 5 to 10-year periods of funding, we may begin to see this movement grow even further. And we have a framing message. I've been trying to give that to you now, so I won't go through that again. I think we have a strong framing message if we can continue to find the ways to step into the gaps where we see them, and there are many, in what we understand as justice, going far beyond legal justice and looking at justice for humanity. What does it mean to live in just relationships? Some signs of a restorative justice movement for me are the social political climate that's calling it forth here in the United States. For sure, our social political climate of the last presidency have pushed our communities to say, we want a different way of being together. Cross-sectoral applications, which I have mentioned already, are growing. The applications in community policing, the applications across the universities, as I've said before, to deal with harm in the university campus, and the applications in the workplace. Schools and education is growing exponentially, and environment and other places I've mentioned. We're seeing that it's becoming less and less institutional and more decentralized, which is a sign of movement building. I'm not against institution, but I'm concerned that we spend a lot of time tinkering and reforming certain institutions when in fact a decentralized approach may be the most important When I think about this, I think about the call that's happening here in the United States for a truth-telling process around our racial justice history, our genocide against the indigenous peoples, as well as the enslavement of African people of African descent for many, many decades and years. That is a call that's saying we don't want a big truth commission set up in Washington, D.C. We believe that we're telling the truth locally, and we have mapped this about 150, or maybe now even more. I think it's between 120, 150 different local communities are having truth-telling processes around this racial violence and this racial history. And so as those begin to mushroom and develop and grow, we are beginning to see a movement that's pushing the whole country to a reckoning, we hope. It's a reordering of power. There is a sense that young people are taking the lead. There is a sense that these movements are no longer going to be carried by one charismatic person like a Gandhi or King or whatever you imagine, but that there are going to be multiple leaders, pluralistic leadership going forward. And we're seeing that in many different ways. And as I've said before, it's a bottom-up approach. And that makes it particularly powerful and I think important. How do we measure a movement? This is often what I'm asked. How do you measure movements? Well, it's difficult. One thing you can look at is legislative change, but that's only one aspect. And that has to be really good legislation, not legislation in general, because sometimes legislation, as we have seen in the field, can simply restrict or even make the requirements of this movement even more specific and tight. The cultural and attitude shift is really important, and we're beginning to see some of that. There are different ways to measure that through surveys and so on, but specifically looking at what is justice and what does justice feel like? What does justice look like? Not what is justice from legal codes or theoretically, but what does justice mean on a day-to-day basis? Each of us know what that feeling is, but we've been told justice is encompassed in a legal framework or a set of legal codes alone. I have found a lot of help in thinking about this through emergent adaptive systems, where we understand, as I mentioned before, that natural systems change and morph in many different ways, and they don't have to, they're not a mechanical process of a replacement. And so as I've studied emergent adaptive systems, there are many different theories out there and many different ideas. But three things that are important, I think, very important, is we need to ask about the containers. Where is justice contained? What justice structures are currently holding what we think is justice? And how can we potentially change those, reform, or transform those if they're not working well? Second is differences. We have been told there are certain differences within a system, within a society, within an organization that are irreconcilable. We need to question those differences. We need to say, hey, just because this part of the system has never talked to this part of the system, maybe if we can get them together and start to dialogue, it will change the system. What would it look like in our workplace to have our finance department talking to our creative learning department? I don't know, but maybe there would be new things that would come out of that, using that as a very loose example. And then finally, exchanges. All systems are supported and if you will, buoyed by these exchanges between the elemental parts of the system. And many of those get into status quo exchanges or ruts. We need to ask, are those exchanges working? And if they aren't, then how do we reimagine those exchanges? And how do we connect networks of people together or ideas together and resources together that will shift the system? I'm going to close up now. I'm aware of my time. We are at a precipice, I believe, and I'm very excited about the possibilities of restorative justice as a social justice movement. Van Ness and Strong encourage us to think about 4 values, but I also think these are both values and processes that characterize our restorative justice in the broadest sense. They involve encounter, not always, but often. They involve amends, which encompasses the reparations, the repair, and the restitution. They involve reintegration, meaning we are constantly thinking about how do we do our work so that those who have been harmed have a way in which they can be rehumanized and brought into the human community. and those who have been harmed can be healed enough to come back or to live in or be in the same, coexist in the same space with those who maybe have harmed. And then of course, inclusion, that's closely connected to reintegration. How do we keep our processes inclusive, our solutions inclusive, our institutional or structural forms inclusive? One of our presidents said this: far better is it to dare great things, to achieve glorious triumphs, though checkered by failure, than to take rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much. For they live in that gray twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat. I believe we are at that place where we can decide to step into the risk of moving restorative justice and living into and leaning into restorative justice as a social justice movement. And we will not be the first. There is already a current. There is already a pulse. We need to find it in our own contexts and move forward. And this last slide simply gives a vision. We imagine restorative justice as transformative. Not only is it about safety and security, which sometimes we feel like that's at risk right now, that's under threat, and we need to work at that. And so I'm not in any way saying that's a small thing. But that safety and security is to allow us as human beings freedom and autonomy to relate to and to connect with whoever we feel, and to build those meaningful relationships and connections, and ultimately to align our social political structures that they will serve and sustain the values of common good, which is really what restorative justice primarily requires of us. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Dr. Stoffel, and how wonderful that you could actually join us today, and you actually made it to the party. Your last slide actually just, I felt I was going up onto this, on my surfboard on the top of the wave with so much of hope and so much of vigor. Thank you so much for that really special presentation. Your address has actually highlighted for all of us the coming of age of restorative justice, both in the academic as well as in the professional space. And this call for this corrective or realignment to the justice system and this transformative forward view of justice towards a social justice movement is extremely important at this time. Indeed, because of this restorative justice, because of its interdisciplinary ethos, it can become a vehicle for nonviolent social and structural change, a practice for building social capital, for community development, and guiding the values of the restorative approach to transitional justice at the global level. Yes, definitely, Dr. Stoffel, your insights on restorative justice give us hope for a really more satisfying form of justice for the future. Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. Our next speaker is actually Ms. Leslie Ann van Saun. Following the midwinter incidences of unrest and violence in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, Khulisa Social Solutions brought together perpetrators of violence, parents, victims, foreign shop owners, NGOs, and others impacted by the violence to tell their stories and come to an understanding of what happened and begin a process of healing. Ms. Leslie Ann van Saun will elaborate on the findings from recordings that show how peacemaking circles can increase the social capital of communities through enhancing community and individual self-reliance, increasing and improving communication and cohesion. Her presentation will show how the community itself has a pivotal role in resolving and preventing crime. Thank you. Over to you, Leslie Ann.
Hi everybody. I'm so excited to be here, and Carl, I'm so pleased you made it. I think we're all just hanging on your lips, the wisdom that you've imparted with us. Before I share my story about Alex with you, I just would like to give a little bit of history about Khulisa, which started over 24 years ago in partnership with the Department of Correctional Services, Social Development, SAPS, and the Department of Education. We're so delighted that over the years we've been able to navigate our way into many different aspects of restorative justice through our partnership with these key departments. So even today is very much community-centric. I'd like to acknowledge the support that we've had, especially from social development over the past 24 years. Kalisa started off working with young offenders, and when we utilize storytelling as a methodology to therapeutically enable young people to share their stories, my life changed because I'd never been into a prison. And when I listened to the stories of these young offenders, I developed a philosophy in life, which is the underlying philosophy of Kalisa's to this day, is don't ask somebody what they did, but what happened to them. And I believe that restorative justice and through the thousands and thousands of cases that we've dealt with is all about finding out the causal factors of where the conflict actually arose in the first place. And it's been such a privilege over the years working with so many amazing people and having been able to resolve some of the most hideous circumstances with rape, violence, offenders coming back who were in death row, and helping their families to understand them and accept them. And it is all about storytelling. And in South Africa, I hope that we're going to, through this, learn to start sharing our stories more so we can begin to bridge the great divide. But now I'm going to tell you about my experience in Alex, where Kalisa started operating 20 years ago. Alexander is a very complex township. There are a mass of NGOs that have come and gone, funding has come and gone, and there is so much hopelessness in that community because of the abuse and exploitation. And when we decided to embark on this peacemaking initiative a week after the looting, I was absolutely amazed by the wisdom that came from the bottom of the pyramid. As Carl said earlier on, that's who we need to consult. So the presentation I'm sharing with you now is actually about what we learned through engaging with these community members. Thank you. Kalisa, could I maybe ask you to help me with sharing the screen? I seem to have a little bit of a technical problem. Thank you. So as I said, this is a case study on the post-violence in Alexander. So moving on to the next slide, we engage with over 230 community members, and as we said, they were from all sectors of the community. We invited them just to come along to actually share their stories. It was in the midst of terrible trauma and confusion and mayhem. And after the 14 dialogue circles, these are the key outcomes that we actually analyzed through interpreting the stories of the partners who actually joined forces with us, that economic conditions were a major precipitator of crime. Apathy about the social economic conditions lead to destructive behavior and isolation. Negative attitudes are contagious within communities and polarize individuals into opposing factions. Dysfunctionality was associated with misunderstanding and inequality, which contribute towards crime. Community disintegration can be addressed by building positive connections and a sense of unity. Other findings were the community believes that it has a pivotal role in resolving and preventing crime. Both individuals and collective accountability are required to foster change. The communities in Alex, there are many, many NGOs that are disconnected, and the informal community organizations are trying to attempt to facilitate peace and human security, particularly now, and you'll be hearing from my colleague just now, just how, particularly with the issue of gender-based violence. There is now, and unquestionably following all our dialogues, an awakening need for conversations around the way that we now can coexist in Alex. The need for new connections is in different contexts now needs to be developed in order to build solid partnerships. Community members as a collaborative need to deal with inequality, and the capacitation of these entities will demonstrate the capabilities that these individuals have to negotiate their own peace moving forward. These were the gaps that we identified, that there's a hunger amongst the NGO sector to obtain the skills to work effectively at a grassroots level. What was so amazing in engaging with these people, that even though they live on top of each other and in such intense environments, is that they don't talk to each other. And in many cases, it was the first time that the community members had actually gone into a room and spoken to each other. And in this particular time of mayhem, had actually shared their fears and their apprehension, and actually listened to that, the fact that they weren't alone in this trauma. And that the communities have also asked for mentoring and to assist them in dealing with crime themselves. And that we should also look at capacitating, especially around gender-based violence, in order to bring peace into the community. So the benefits of the circles is, this is now taken from actual quotes received. This is not a quick fix final solution, but a long-term chance to build networks of support and shared responsibility for working through arising and addressing our challenges. Then helped members to, our dialogues help members to reach out to each other and to discover much deeper connections, providing chances for them to facilitate healing and transformation. The dialogues were considered to forge partnerships that could lessen dependence on the state when responding to crime, and were also thought to increase the social capital of communities through enhancing individuals' self-reliance. So moving forward, KwaZulu, in collaboration with the Restorative Justice Center, and hopefully many other NGOs and partners, we are looking at a new systematic and systemic approach in our way forward. And we want to depart from the reactive curative approach, which is about interventions which respond to cases of conflicts, violence, and crimes, to much more proactive, preventative approach of initiating peace within all aspects of the communities, starting with the family, and then more especially in the school environment. We are intent on developing ways to avoid conflict, and in the long run, looking at much more effective ways to diffuse already existing, often explosive conflicts. And then behavior patterns of violence acquired through socialization within the family and the community at large will have to be replaced by non-confrontational communication skills, peaceful human relations, management, and community cohesion. And just referring back to Lydia's case study, our LGBTIQ activist, what she has achieved by putting out peacemaking, as opposed to her reacting to the gross violations that she was exposed to for over a decade. She is now an advocate of peace and is really demonstrating how we can change behavior patterns in communities through this proactive approach. And then, of course, our preventative approach, again, will reduce violence and crime. And then from my side, before I hand over to my colleague from the Alexander NGO Coalition, it is KwaZulu's intention to reach a critical mass of peace mediators in South Africa to reduce crime, violence, and bullying as a sustainable, ongoing process. Our people of South Africa are emerging as community organizers, community developers, and civil society activists. They are asking us what restorative justice can teach them. A connection between restorative justice and providing values, principles, and practices can encourage and lead the community to make their own democratic decisions through empowerment and capacitating them. And this is not just a rhetoric or a comment. We have irrefutable evidence of over 15 years of doing work at this level, of how this is so possible. We just got to, each and every one of us, consider how we can contribute towards increased dialogue, understanding each other, and promoting human dignity. I'm now going to hand you over for just a short while to my colleague, Hema. If we could just this is Mr. Patrick Baloy, who is the founder of the Alexandra NGO Coalition, and he's going to share some of his insights with you following our interventions in Alex. So over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to greet everyone. My name is Patrick Baloy, has been introduced. I'm from Alexandra. I'm the founder of the Alex NGO Foundation. The idea for us to create Alex NGO Foundation was to ensure that we bring peace and stability amongst all those that are running organizations in Alexandra. We've seen the need that our people are working in silos. So we wanted to find a space where we can bring peace and cohesion amongst the organization. So as soon as we did the work with KSS, it then opened eyes for us. It opened an opportunity for us, and we started understanding that as the NGOs, our people need to be capacitated so that they can then be able to resolve dispute amongst themselves within the organization space, within their communities. There is a lot of work that we have done with regard to improving the social cohesion amongst the South African community and the non-national business community. As you know, that in Alexandra, there is the Somalians, Ethiopians. So it is important for us to bring that integration together. And then the business community that is coming from your Bangladesh community. So this integration of restorative justice is important for us to undertake as we move forward, because our people, when there is issues, they will tend to go to these shops and start looting at them. But if we would capacitate our leaders, our people, to start understanding that we are brothers and sisters, we are going to avoid these issues as we move forward. Our motto with KSS is to say that we need to capacitate, firstly, the leaders of the organization so that themselves, they can be able to go out and be the champions of restorative justice, the processes, as we are doing a lot of work with regard to the gender-based violence. We are very, very excited to be part and parcel of this webinar. Our request is to ensure that we mobilize the resources moving forward so that structures like KSS can be given an opportunity to assist us in terms of making sure that we equip, we capacitate, we train our organizational members so that the work that we've trained with them, they can become the trainers themselves on the ground. So we are very excited to be part and parcel of this webinar, and it is a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you very much without wasting time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie Ann, and thank you so much, Mr. Patrick Baloy, for sharing your experiences and your insights and really doing grassroots community development work and community building. It is now my great pleasure to call upon Professor Anne Skelton, a well-known and well-respected researcher and practitioner in the field of restorative justice and child justice in South Africa, and she will actually present to us a way forward on how restorative approaches can enhance access to justice across all sectors in South Africa. Thereafter, panelists will try to respond to some of the questions that have been posed by participants. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Professor Anne Skelton. You may go ahead.
Thank you very much, Hema. And I must say, what a fascinating conversation it has been today. I'm not actually going to give a formal presentation. I'm going to try to draw together the strands of the conversation that we've been listening to. So we started off our day hearing really from Mike Batley about the national policy framework that didn't go anywhere, and the assessment by Mike and myself from 2019, and in which we actually mapped out a slightly depressing picture of where we thought restorative justice was going. But although we tried to look broadly, it is true that we were also mostly focusing on restorative justice within the criminal justice sphere, although we touched and we did pick up that there was a lot going on in the education sphere and so on. So I don't think that that it means that there is not still a lot of scope for hope and I'll talk more about that in a moment, across a range of different settings, as we have heard. But even in that criminal justice space, we need to pick up the work that we were doing, and we need to think about how, and Mike gave us a few pointers on what we should do to get that national policy framework back on the table, and to continue to work with government to form partnerships for effective restorative justice re-ignition, if I can put it that way, because we have it all there in our legislative frameworks, but it isn't actually happening, and we need to think about how we can, what isn't happening on the scale that we would like it to be within the criminal justice system. We then moved on to a variety of different contexts, which I must say I found fascinating. So we heard, for example, about work being done in the workplace. We heard about the space of people with albinism and how restorative justice was used to empower. Similar story from the LGBTIQ space as well, and how important that has been to transform victims into peacemakers, with again, that word empowered coming up, and capacitated. We heard a lot of that today. In the chat, we were seeing people working in schools, and we all know, although it wasn't talked about here today, that South African schools have become a site where there has been quite a lot of dispute. There have been, issues, clashes of culture, debates about language, about Black hair, all kinds of issues that have come up where restorative justice has been deployed, but could be used more as well. Very fascinating to hear about the use of restorative justice following the protests. I think all South Africans were shaken this year by the protests that occurred. And it's wonderful to hear that restorative justice has already been used in that space. And one can only imagine how much more engagement could be done in those spaces as well. Another thing that hasn't been mentioned today, but is very interesting work that's going on in South Africa, is work relating to the environment. The Endangered Wildlife Trust has been working on restorative justice responses to environmental crimes. And that is another very innovative space. And actually this year's theme for Restorative Justice Week, I think, is focusing on innovations. And I must say, I have heard a lot of innovations today. Then we heard, of course, from Carl, who took us to the central theme of restorative justice and social justice. And I think some of what Leslie Ann and her colleague from Alexandra, Patrick, was speaking to here was about social justice, where when they looked at what was behind the protests, although we all know that there was a kind of, there was the match that was lit being Zuma's imprisonment, but behind it was socioeconomic hardship, socioeconomic disparity. That was why it was such a dry tinder that could go the way that it did. And so to work on the reasons for that, one has to start working on the broader socioeconomic rights terrain. And I think this is what Carl was also telling us, that actually we have to be conscious of that. So it seems to me that we need to be looking for a restorative justice that is fit for the 2020s. And back in the 1990s, when many of us started working on restorative justice, we had the backdrop of the TRC, of South Africa's massive transition from apartheid to a democratic society. We had Nelson Mandela, right? So you didn't really have to do a lot of work to convince people that restorative justice was the way to go. You didn't have to explain what reconciliation was. Everybody knew that that was what we were driving for. Now, I work in a law faculty, and I can tell you that nobody's very impressed with the word reconciliation today. What the debates are in my faculty are about decolonization and deconstruction. And in fact, I was sitting in a meeting just the other day where a colleague said, well, the word transformation and transformative was part of a compromise that had to be made in the 1990s, but it doesn't necessarily mean that transformation was really what the government engaged in since then, and it need not be the framework for everything that we do. So if we want our restorative justice to have an academic home, we are going to need to engage with those debates. And I know that restorative scholars all over the world are beginning to engage with those debates, because we're going to need to realize, we must realize that the magic bullet words and phrases that we had in the 1990s are just not magic bullets anymore. And actually, I shouldn't use such a non-violent term. I should talk about, they are not the pearls of wisdom that they used to be. I think we want to try to rediscover the language of restorative justice, and how it does help us, because for every moment that we deconstruct, we also will have to reconstruct. And when we reconstruct, we can do that reconstructing in a restorative justice way. But we are academically going to have to find our pathways there. But of course, academia is only part of where all of this is going to happen, but seeing that UKZN is hosting. Oh, and by the way, it's also my alma mater. I did my undergraduate degrees at UKZN too. So we need to go beyond that space. And I think what we want to do is to learn from all of these amazing experiments, innovations that are happening on the ground, and we must partner so that that does get written up, so that it has the theoretical groundswell, base, but at the same time, academia must also learn from practice, and that, I think, those are all of the partnerships that we are going to have to forge going forward. So I'm seeing a restorative justice reborn as a socially connected social justice framing going forward, a partnership between academics, practitioners, and communities. And we need to also be able to answer some of the important questions of this age. We need to tap into all of those discussions about environmental justice, about mental health issues, about isolation that has been caused by pandemics, the pandemic, and also about cyberspace and its new challenges and risks and opportunities, as Carl said. Everything that is a risk and everything that is a challenge is also simply an opportunity to start engaging and debating. I'm not going to talk longer because everyone said everything already, but those were just some of the things that were going through my brain as we were listening, and I'm sure they were going through yours as well. And I hope that this is just the first of many re-engagements going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Anne, and thank you, really. I mean, you've brought all of that so wonderfully together, and you've woven all the threads that, each of the speakers have brought into this beautiful, a forward-looking, transformative way of, our perceptions of what restorative justice should be in the future. And as you said, that, we perhaps have, what we understood previously has become quite outdated. And we need to now reconfigure and realign our thinking. We have just a few questions on the Q&A. I think one of those was that whether there are any reference articles for Carl's presentation. I think that that particular person might be coming from an academic space, wanting to refer to some theoretical perspectives on restorative justice as a social movement, and perhaps that Carl would be able to sort of assist with that. And other than that, I don't see many more, apart from very, very complimentary comments on the chat. I will use the next few minutes, we have a few minutes left, to give each of the speakers to give a few concluding remarks, after which I would call upon Professor Kalema to give us the vote of thanks. Thank you. May I call upon Mike Batley? Perhaps if you have any few concluding remarks, you can go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather. I was just looking at, I'm not sure of the title, I think it's somebody, a fairly senior official from Correctional Services, who had some comments there about victims not always being prepared to participate in restorative justice processes, and that the motive of offenders is not always pure, often mainly about release. So let me just try and make a couple of comments about that. Firstly, about victims' participation. I think it's very difficult if the program is being driven exclusively by the Department of Correctional Services to make it victim-centered, because inherently the Department of Correctional Services is offender-centric. And so it's always going, if anybody representing the department engages with the victim, it's from the understanding that they are actually working with the offender. And so I think that's where we need partnerships with civil society organizations, obviously who are mandated and in a well-defined partnership, but that can change the perception of victims and community. So I think the way that victims are approached makes a big difference. And I think that very often victims, if they're approached correctly, if their needs are understood and taken into account, can be much more responsive. Obviously not always, and we need to respect that, but that does make a difference. And in terms of motives, I'm not sure that we need to measure people's motives. I think that it is true that if somebody is not willing to accept responsibility, not willing to apologize authentically, then probably the meeting with the victim shouldn't go ahead. But I think one can gauge that fairly straightforwardly. And beyond that, I think we need to accept that human motives are always mixed. All of our motives are always mixed. And if you're in prison and you're wanting to get out, obviously that is going to be one of your motives. But as long as an offender is willing to accept responsibility, I think one can work with that. So long as they're not going to get into victim blaming, then it's, I think one can work with that. And very often the magic happens, as Carl and Anne were referring to just now. The process itself is powerful. And so long as those basics are in place, I think one can engage the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. I'll hand over to Dr. Stoffel, if you have any few concluding remarks.
Just to note one thing in the chat that I saw, well, two things. Let me just say, I put in the chat a resource. It's probably embedded in it didn't go in the order I was hoping it to do. I can put that again, but this is an online resource. You can also, it also has been published as a book that I co-edited called Listening to the Movement. So someone was asking about, can we read some more on this? I'm happy to share that link again in the chat right now. You can find the book on Amazon stuff, but at this Zare Institute website, you'll be able to download it free, or chapters from it, or read the chapters online if you would like. Let me just say, second thing is someone mentioned the importance of inclusion of indigenous restorative justice institutions and platforms. Very important in my mind. But two cautions: we tend to also run into the issue of how can I say it? White nostalgia. We glorify and I'm speaking to my white brothers and sisters, the indigenous processes, and sometimes we end up appropriating them in ways that are not helpful or respectable. And so I really encourage a dialogue into this, and then an understanding that there are many practices that are restorative justice connected that may be called something different in indigenous communities, and have been going on for many decades and centuries before the contemporary restorative justice process. So it's a really important process that we accompany and walk together. Let's make sure that we do that as respectfully as possible, that we can be in a posture of learning from each other in this process. But I do believe that there's a great deal that our indigenous cultures and processes can offer our restorative practice and what we understand as restorative justice today in the applications all across society. Many of the indigenous processes have moved beyond just interpersonal encounters and healing, but also to think about intercommunal and communal or collectivized processes of justice and healing. And for that, it's a great gift, because I think that's one of our challenges in the westernized, individualized cultures that have also spread across the urban centers globally. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you very much. I'd like to call upon Vanessa. Vanessa, for a few concluding remarks.
No, I think, well, they've covered it. I think it was really great and interesting to listen to all the perspectives. I love the movement, restorative justice as a movement. I love that it says that it requires us all, as Anne says, a partnership amongst all of us at all different levels, academics, practitioners, community, working side by side. And it requires a change and a shift in paradigm. I think we can no longer continue with this violent, punitive justice. We really need restoration, healing, and a new system of justice that would really bring healing to our world. So I'm just thankful to everyone working alongside and all the community activists. Well done to you, and let us continue this amazing work together. And thank you for the participants, for your engaging questions, and for being present, and the speakers. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. Leslie Ann, a few words from you.
Yes, Hema, thank you very much for facilitating this and embracing the opportunity to host this. We go back many, many years, and we've worked through many, many restorative journeys together. So I really want to acknowledge you and pay tribute to you for that. And for me, it's just so exciting that there's an agenda of new thinking that's been put forward on the table, and that we're not anymore going to only rely on waiting for the government, but encourage the government to join forces with us and start innovating, showing new ways of peace building at a grassroots level. And I know that we'll get the support and endorsement that we need, but it's up to us now to make sure that we take the lead. So thank you, and thanks to all the speakers, and it's been so wonderful working with you in advance of this exciting event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you on behalf of Professor Kalema. I think he's got another engagement. He's had to leave. I would like to actually thank all the participants, Dr. Stoffel, Leslie Ann, Professor Anne Skelton, Mr. Mike Lee, Ms. Vanessa Padiachi. Thank you so much for participating in this webinar. It is the first, I think, the university has hosted, and I'm hoping that the university will come on board to do this as an annual event. And I'm sure Professor Kalema would be very, very happy to bring us all on board. One key issue that I think Professor Skelton highlighted is the need for academics to enter into spaces that we normally tend not to step out into, and where we as academics can then disseminate all this grassroots information and give these organizations that work integrally with communities, to give them the theoretical foundation and share our knowledge and capacity build at that level. So as academics, we do have a role to play in making this into a really a movement that is going to actually take us forward in the future. So thank you once again, everyone, and to all the number of participants from all over the world. Thank you for joining us on this really, really special occasion of International Restorative Justice Week. And hopefully this will be an annual event, and we will then be inviting all of you again to join us. Thank you very much, and goodbye. Keep safe. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.